Welcome to the Knoy Church podcast. We're glad that you're interested in connecting through this teaching time. If you'd like to connect further, feel free to reach out to us through our website, knoychurch.org. For now, enjoy this teaching from Knoy Church, where our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ.
Good morning. We're in our third week of this series called Shift, and it's only a 4-week series, so next week's our last week. We're trying to engage the idea of maturing in our relationship with Jesus, and we're talking about it from the analogy of shifting a car. That's our idea of what it means to mature in Christ. So when we first start out, we're in first gear, right? And the thing is, you can't stay in first gear forever. You can't drive very far on the road in first gear because first gear doesn't let you drive very fast, right? You can't drive on the highway in first gear, right? You got to get up to fifth gear to drive on the highway. That's highway speeds. But you also can't start in fifth gear because the car will stall in fifth gear. You have to use all the gears, first through fifth. That's the key. And that's what it means to really mature, is using all the gears. And here, there are some things that go along with being able to use all your gears. Learning how to start and stop. Learning how to actually drive a manual car. If you don't know how to start and stop, and you can just drive in fifth gear on the highway, if you see somebody in trouble with their four-ways on, you can't stop and help them, can you? You just got to zoom on past. And so if you see your brother or sister in trouble in the Christian faith, there's not much you can do unless you know how to use all your gears. So using all your gears allows you to help other people. If you don't know how to use all your gears, if you don't know how to drive a stick shift, then you can't teach anybody else how to drive a stick shift. And you shouldn't. So we need to learn how to shift. We need to learn how to grow in our faith, in our walk with Jesus. We need to move towards maturity, and this is true whether you just started following Jesus or you've been following Jesus for your whole life. So, something we've said every single week, something we're going to keep saying for one more week, is that growth never ends. Again, whether you're a new believer or you've been a believer for your whole life, growth never ends. We always need to be learners, and anyone can be our teacher. We just have to have our eyes open. Anyone can be our teacher. So this week, we're entering the third week of our series. But for us to get the most out of this, we need to keep remembering what we've talked about. So, in week 1, we discussed how important it is not to judge others. Healthy growth first starts by looking at ourselves. Okay? When we grab that shifter knob for the first time, all of our fingers are pointed back at us. We're not pointing at anybody else. All our fingers are pointed back at us. Healthy growth starts by looking at us. We need to determine how we should grow. We don't need to be looking and determining how anybody else should grow. All right? Scripture is not a weapon that we should use against other people. Now, we can help other people grow. There's no doubt about that. And we're called to that in our Christian walk. But first, start with yourself. Our purpose is growth in love, not judgment. We also don't judge people who don't follow Jesus for not following Jesus. Okay? Not even Jesus did that. Jesus didn't judge a pagan for being a pagan. Jesus' harshest judgment was always reserved for God followers who were hypocritical. That is who he judged most harshly. What Jesus did when he encountered somebody who didn't follow God is Jesus built bridges to those people. He broke bread with them. He ate with them, he talked with them, and he showed them an entirely new way to live, which is something that we can do. We can follow the Jesus way by entering into relationship with people who don't know God, who don't follow Jesus. And rather than us being worried that we're going to stop following God, we can make choices to live our life with integrity. We don't need to do the things that we don't believe in to be in relationship with people who don't follow Jesus. Okay? If I don't want to swear, I don't have to swear. If I don't want to drink, I don't have to drink. I don't have to do the things that make me uncomfortable to be in relationship with people. I can have integrity in my beliefs. And most of the time, that means everything to people who don't follow Jesus. So rather than be full of vinegar and judgment, I have integrity in my faith, and then by example, I show a new way of life to people who may have never, ever seen that before. That was week 1. Week 2, we talked about humility and false humility. Humility is when we remember who we are and who we aren't. We don't have to say that we're bad at things. We don't have to say that we're not good at anything, because that's not true. God wonderfully made and gifted you. You're good at many things. You are his gifted and beloved child. But that doesn't give you the right to platform yourself over other people. It doesn't give you the right to push others down or hold others back from realizing that they are also God's gifted and beloved children. You don't get to use your role as God's child or God's gifted child as a way to hold someone else's giftedness back. False humility is when you take pride. And I don't mean pride in the good way. I mean pride in the bad way. You know, when you start to forget that you're in need of God's grace. When all you can see is that there are other people that are in need of God's grace. When you start to see how other people just are always making mistakes, and you forget that you also make mistakes. You start to see how other people are imperfect all the time, and you forget that you are also imperfect. It's when you start to think you're always right. It's when you start to use your God-given gifting to hold other people back or make them look a little bit less. It's when you take all of those things, that's pride, and you dress it up in spirituality. So when you dress it up in nice spiritual lingo, nice spiritual talk, that is false humility. False humility leads to death. It leads us to being cut off from Christ. And being cut off from Christ in the short term means we stop growth. We stop shifting. But in the long term, it means we die. That was week 2. Now, week 3, today, we need to talk about your wardrobe, okay? And I'm just the guy to do it, okay? Now, I began working in ministry by working in youth ministry. I started that 23 years ago. I had to think about it when I was writing this sermon. I hadn't thought about how long it's been. 23 years is a long time. I didn't start working in churches right away. I started working through summer camp. That was how I started working with youth. And through relationships built with kids and parents at that summer camp, there was a church who was looking for a youth pastor that reached out to me. And they asked me to consider applying for their open youth pastor position. Now, although I'd gone to church my whole life, I had pretty much kept church at arm's length in a lot of ways. And the idea of church ministry, not even an idea. Because I had found church to be generally untrustworthy and often kind of hypocritical. Often I thought church folk were more interested in keeping other church folk pretty content and happy on the inside of church, rather than being interested on what was happening outside of church. They were more interested in keeping the status quo inside than reaching folks who needed help outside of the church. Now, I had definitely experienced a call from God to ministry. There was no doubt about that in my life. But the places that I had done ministry were things like summer camp or at-risk youth ministries or working with kids from juvenile detention centers or kids that were a part of court-mandated drug and alcohol rehab programs. It was places that were far from church, not associated with church. And I suppose because those were the places that I traveled, my appearance reflected my traveling. So my appearance in those days were messy, spiky hair, earrings, ripped jeans, a couple of tattoos, an old army jacket, usually. Not exactly the clean-cut sort of look that you would find acceptable in most churchy sort of places. And so working in a churchy sort of place had never really crossed my mind because it really felt like the real work was somewhere else. That's the honest truth. So when that church called me, it really felt like a joke. I had to keep from laughing, and I just said, no, I'm not the church kind of guy, so no thanks. I hope I said no thanks. I hope I said it nicely. But then they called back a second time, and it made me go, all right, maybe I should pray about it. And what I felt like I heard was just go through the process. So I went through the process and made it to the end. My final interview was with the church board, and they put me in this room to wait to go into the church board. And they had me in the same room as somebody else who was also there for their final interview for another position. Now, I dressed up for this interview. I left my army jacket in the car, and I wore a polo shirt. I kept the hair and the earrings and the ripped jeans, but I thought I did pretty good. But this other guy came into the room and sat down next to me, and he was wearing a crisp black suit and a tie. He had a perfect side part in his hair, a shiny watch and dress shoes. And when he walked in and saw me, he looked at me with his mouth wide open, and I looked at him with my mouth wide open. We both did the whole up-down thing and didn't say a word, and he sat down, I sat down. He got called in before me, and then I never saw him, and then I got called in. And, you know, we talked to each other later, and we both discovered that what we both thought was, there's no way I'm in the right place. Like, we're in the wrong church. Both of us are in the wrong church. And our wardrobe expresses something about us, doesn't it? The way you dress expresses something about you. Brian was his name. We became good friends because we were both hired that night. I was hired to be a youth pastor, and he was hired to be the music minister. My background was at-risk youth. He was a music teacher and the member of an orchestra. So it made sense that we dressed the way we dressed. As the years went by, my look softened a bit, away from the hardness of my at-risk background. And you can tell today, well, maybe not today, but you can tell now, and the ripped jeans are gone, the army jacket's gone, you know, the earrings are gone. But Brian's look softened too. The rigid suit and tie became less rigid over the years. We had to settle into something that wasn't about us. It wasn't a reflection of us as much as it was where we were and who we were serving. And what I can say is that part of what changed my appearance is my heart for ministry in the church began to soften. Now, I can't say that I was wrong about some of my thoughts about hypocrisy and comfortability in the church. But I was wrong in thinking that all the needs were out there and there were no needs in here. Today, I have a softer heart for ministry in the church. But here's the thing. Change is the key. We need to change. That's how we shift into the next gear, is we have to change. You can't stay the same forever. And that might be a no-brainer for you. As you think about what it means to mature in your faith, you might go, oh, no duh, Nick. But many of us are trying so hard not to change, to claim maturity without changing anything. We have to change. And the change in our lives has to be evident. Colossians chapter 3, verses 5-7, it says this: "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived." Sexual immorality is the Greek word porneia, and that just describes any kind of sex outside of marriage. It's a very general word. Impurity is the Greek word akatharsia, and what it means here is morally impure thoughts, words, and acts. Lust is the word pathos. It means uncontrolled desire. Evil desires is a phrase that's similar to the meaning of pathos, but it's general and it's more focused on anger. Greed is the word pleonexion, and it means ruthless desire for more. Never have I heard a better definition for greed: ruthless desire for more. Idolatry is the word idolatria, and it means putting self-interest and things in the place of God. When Paul writes this letter to the Colossians, he lists out these things. He says, this is part of your old life. You got to change these things. This has to go. And now, if you've been a believer for a long time, my hope would be that these things have already changed. And if they have, great. But know that the expectation of being a believer is that there is change in your life. Change is how we grab the next gear. If we follow Jesus, then we don't walk in the ways that we once walked. We leave those ways behind. Some of these things that Paul mentions are visible to the outside world, and some are less visible. Idolatry, greed, sexual immorality, those are observable things to other people. Impure thoughts, lust, evil desires, they're a lot less so. Some things are observable. And when you make the change, people can see it, right? It's like changing your clothes, right? So we make a change. It's observable. You can see a change. If we're truly changing, some of the change should be evident in our lives. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's often not. Almost never is it perfect. But some of the change should be evident. We should see some steps toward change as we follow Jesus. Paul makes his thoughts pretty clear. When you were not believing, you didn't have to think about things like sex and impurity and lust and greed and evil desire and idolatry. So he's like, let's start there. You didn't have to think about those things before. Now you need to think about those things. Now that you follow God, those are the first things to go. Leave those things at the door. But that's just the outer layer. That's just you taking off the coat. That's the first thing to go. Because once you take off the coat, there's other layers that you have to work on. There's more to get at. And why is that? Because we're never done growing. okay? We're never done. There's always more for us to work on. So what an accomplishment if you can say that you got that coat off. Way to go. Amazing. You should pat yourself on the back. You should have a celebration, throw some balloons, confetti, whatever that thing's called, right? That's a celebration, okay? But there's always more growth to be had. So Paul goes on. In Colossians 3, verse 8, he says this, "But now you must also rid yourselves of all these things, such as anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language. Don't lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self with its practices." So Paul moves on. He goes from things like we just mentioned to things that are of our attitude and speech. And to do it, he uses this word, apotheme. And that word is the same word that is used in the story of the stoning of Stephen. In the story of the stoning of Stephen, the men and women who come to do the stoning take off their cloak and lay them at Saul's feet. And the word to take off is this word, to take off a garment. And he says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to take off these things. So, take off anger, right? And we see a difference. You notice a difference. I feel a little bit lighter, a little bit cooler, if I'm honest. Take off rage. Take off malice. It's like my closet is empty at home. Take off slander. Take off filthy language. Take off lying to one another. We're done. Okay? But he's saying, like it's a garment of clothing, take those off. Because when you do, you notice a difference. I was up here in a winter coat. There's a difference. Isn't there? Okay. But if you're like me, you're going to ask the question, why are we taking off these layers? Is it enough that it's written down in a book that's 2,000 years old? Is it enough that Paul wrote a letter to a church in a city called Colossae? Is it enough? Why are we taking off these layers? Why no anger? Why no rage? Why no malice? Why no slander? Why no filthy language? Why no lying to one another? Why, Paul? He says, you've taken off your old self with its practices, and you're putting on a new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Because you get a new self. That's why. The old self is gone, you get a new self. Get rid of the old self. That's really what he's trying to say. You had this old life. Leave that old life for the new one so much better. So stop going back to the old life. It's not good. It's not as good as you think. Embrace the new life. That is why. And I suppose that I could put on a robe or a suit or something to show you what the new life is. But I don't like that idea because I don't want to cover up the self. I feel like part of the work is finally getting down to this. This is what God made. And finally, I've been able to rid myself of this stuff, right? I've done the work. And now I've found out this thing that God made. I can take a breath. I don't want to cover it up with something. And so when I think about the new self that God is giving me, I like the idea of Jesus handing me a mirror. Because now I can see the image of God in me. And I also don't like the idea of covering this up, because while I think I want to see the image of God in me, I think we also are all aware that at any point in time, it'd be really easy for me to pick one of these back up and put it on. I could put my anger back on at any time. I could put my lies back on at any time. And so if I have this mirror, it's so much easier for me to see that I put this back on. That new self that Christ has given me as a mirror lets me just watch. And it lets me see the image of God in me, which from the beginning, God said, let us create man in our image, right? And it's precisely in that image that Paul wants to remind us of in verse 11. He says, in the image of Christ, here, there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free, but Christ is all and is in all. In the image of Christ, all that divides us is absent. All that we would use to create lines has vanished. The things that we think matter don't. I mean, in Paul's day, they used dividing lines to declare you in or out based on whether you were a Jew or not a Jew. The law that you kept, circumcision, declared you in or out. The language that you spoke, Greek or not Greek. The education that you had. The social standing that you had. Paul's saying none of that actually matters. None of it matters. What ended up mattering is Christ. Christ is all. And then, believe it or not, Paul says, Christ is in all. Christ is in the slave and the free. He's in the educated and the uneducated. Christ isn't held back by the language you speak. Christ is in every single language and every single one. Christ breaks through the law. Circumcised, uncircumcised, doesn't matter. Christ is in all. Christ is for the Jew and for the Gentile. Christ is in all, and it's all. You just can't stop him. And Paul wants to make that clear. The image of God from the beginning of time is in each of us. But the thing is you can get sidetracked from him. And I think that's what Paul wants to warn us about. While the image of Christ is in you, you can get sidetracked from him. And that's why the clothes matter. That's why your fashion matters. That's why you got to put on the new clothes. Because you can get sidetracked. Because you can get rid of the old clothes. But at any point, you can pick them up. And I got these clothes, and I wore these clothes probably because, you know what? Lying might have made me fit in. Filthy language, I mean, everybody was doing that. Slander, if I put you down, made me a little bit better. And at any point, it might be easier to put one of these back on and embrace the image of God. It's so easy to get myself sidetracked. And that's why the clothes matter. A few years ago, my brother-in-law invited me to go motorcycle racing. We have our own bikes, so it wasn't like this huge, big expense. It was going to be pretty easy, pretty cheap. And I thought, you know what? Love riding motorcycle on the road. What would it be like to ride on a track? You know, push the bike to its limits, go into a bank turn, ride against some other people, see how you stack up as a rider. It could be a lot of fun. You know, for one weekend, they were going to have this, special class for our type of bikes. So we took the family down to Maryland, made a day of it. And since my brother-in-law was doing this every weekend already, he owned this nice leather suit and built in with pads, the racing boots, the works. He was set up. But the rules technically just said You really just need like a jacket, boots that cover your ankles, and like jeans, you know. It's really, you get away with this. Not with animal, but the rest of it, right? That's really what you get away with, you know. My Kmart work boots would do the job. A pair of jeans covered my legs, and just a generic motorcycle jacket would do it. Which is the direction I was gonna go, because it's still one weekend thing. I'm not gonna spend any extra money on this thing, right? It's just for fun. Now, I did get lucky. My brother-in-law found me a pair of leather pants, so I didn't have to wear jeans. But, and here's the thing, with anybody that likes to do these kind of motorsports, on the last heat of the day, when you're out there and you've been riding the track all day and you finally get comfortable, you get confident, overconfident, and you want to push it as hard as you can, as fast as you can, just to see where the edge is, and you do finally lay the bike down and the bank turn and the bike goes flying off the track and you go sliding across the track, which clothing do you want to be wearing? Do you want to be wearing the clothing that's made for the thing you're doing, or do you want to be wearing the I just got by the rule book clothing? Which one? The right clothes matter. The right clothes can save your life, can save your bones, can save you from getting road rash. The right clothes matter. In our analogy, if you wear the wrong clothes, it can really matter too. If I call myself a follower of Jesus, and I clothe myself in anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language, and lying to one another, then what am I representing? If I call myself a follower of Jesus, and instead of looking at this as a love letter, I look at this as a rule book, and I just get by, what am I representing? The right clothes matter. So as you think about shifting your car, or if you're a motorcycle rider, shifting your motorcycle, think about the steps. You push the clutch in. That's the first step. So we got rid of the outer layer, right? Our winter coat came off. That was our sexual immorality and lust, evil desire, idolatry. That was the first layer that went. We pushed the clutch in. Now we grabbed the gear shift and we pulled it back into our next gear. That was step number 2, and we stripped away all the inner layers. Anger, slander, foul language, and lying to one another. Now the last step. Before we're actually in the next gear, we got to let the clutch out. And what is that? It's putting on the right clothes. So what are those? Verse 12. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I'm acutely aware that there are folks who will hear those words and say, that clothing is too weak. It should be more than that. The Bible talks about a lot of other things in a lot of other places. It sounds a lot angrier and more warlike, and in a lot of other places. Why aren't we focusing on those passages? Some of you might think, in this world, you really want me to be clothed with compassion and kindness, humility and gentleness and patience? Are you serious? Yeah, I'm very serious. First of all, Paul intentionally stacks these things up against the things we just mentioned removing. And so in Paul's mind, he's saying these are the things that combat those things. These are the antithesis to those things. in a world where those things are prevalent, in a world where those are the things that you walked in the old life, these are the things that represent the new life. So yeah, I'm serious. I think Paul was serious. And I think this is a very good representation of what it means to be a Jesus follower. So yeah, I'm serious. And so for a lot of folks, because it's written in Scripture, that's enough for you. You're like, yep, it's written in the book, so I'm good to go. But I'll tell you, for a generation of folks, that is not good enough anymore. So let me give you 3 reasons why, outside of what I just said, as to why I think it's a good idea to clothe yourself with these things: kindness, compassion, humility, gentleness, and patience. Number 1, it's unexpected. Because Christians usually have a reputation that precedes them everywhere they go where they interact with people who are not followers of Jesus. And the reputation is not often a positive one. If it is, man, you have struck a gold mine already. You are 3 steps ahead. That is awesome. But in so many places, the reputation that will precede a non-Christian is often not a positive one. And so it's unexpected when the clothing that you are wearing are clothing of kindness and compassion and humility and gentleness and patience. So in the world that we live in, these are unexpected. But do you know who does expect it? Jesus. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. If you take on the mantle, you take on the name of Christ, these are the clothing that go with it. Number 2, these are the things that are in short supply in the world in which we live. The world in which we live has plenty of impatience. It has plenty of roughness and plenty of pride, plenty of cruelty, and an overall lack of sympathy. And these are the things that combat those very things. If you have the good that is in short supply, if you have the product that is in short supply, then you are the richest person. So share the wealth. Don't hoard it. Spread it around. Lastly, compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. These are the very things you need if you try and teach someone how to drive a stick shift car. I don't know if you've ever done it, but this is what you need. And if you want to ever walk someone through following Jesus, if you ever want to introduce somebody to following Jesus, if you ever want to walk beside somebody who is walking with Jesus, these are the things that you need. These are the traits that you must have. And so let me say these words, and so hear these things. If you see a gap between your private walk and your public talk, slow down your talk and pick up your walk. I'll say it one more time. If you see a gap between your private walk and your public talk, then slow down your talk and pick up your walk. It's no different than just struggling to drive your stick shift car and go get some extra practice in a parking lot, okay? My friends, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. May that be the driving uniform for our community. Amen? Let's pray.
Hi, this is Pastor Nick. Thanks for listening. I hope something that you heard today was very helpful. If you want to connect with us further, feel free to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or our website, canoychurch.org. Sure, I'm glad we're in this together.